I feel responsible. You know, knowledge brings responsibility. So it is not really something that I do in order to get Chinese citizenship or in order to be decorated by. No, it's when I am convinced that China is doing great things for the world, it is my duty to come and to support China. That's what I'm doing, because if I don't do it, I'm a liar.
With a calling to fight against Western imperialism and to document the sufferings of mankind, Andrew has done many things. He has traveled to more than 140 countries.
Culturally, I feel very close to Russia. Otherwise, I'm a world citizen, or more precisely, what they call in Cuba, an internationalist.
He has published around 20 books, both fiction and non-fiction, including bestseller Exposing Lies of the Empire. He has spoken at many institutions and universities, as well as being interviewed by different programs.
I grew up in Eastern Europe, was born in Soviet Union, lived in Czechoslovakia, then in New York City where I studied film. Since then, all over the world, basically in Africa, in Asia Pacific, Oceania, which is South Pacific, and on many occasions in Latin America.
Andrew has been through a lot of war zones and conflicts in many parts of the world, but he still insisted this meaningful duty and continued to fight.
I'm fighting against anything that could be described as an imperialism, as something that is overthrowing people's governments, forcing the ideology on people, basically what the West is doing already for decades and centuries. Through its colonialist and then imperialist domination of the world. So I go everywhere where the countries are being destroyed, where the countries are being attacked by the West. In 1996, when I was working in occupied East Timor, occupied by Indonesia, I was, there was a town called Ermera. It's where Indonesian military arrested all men and boys, and then they raped all women, from babies to like 90 years old grandmothers. They raped them basically to scare the population. And I was there filming, and then they found out that I was there, the Indonesian military. So they dragged me to the intelligence office and they hanged me from the ceiling and they tortured me for some 24 hours until I couldn't use my left arm for about 1 year. After I was released, I went to Japan and they tried to save my arm, and it's working now, but for 1 year I couldn't move it. It was totally blue, my half of the body. The latest film about Indonesia and destruction of the country after 1965 US-backed coup, which is called Downfall. But Indonesia proved to be too independent, too socialist for the United States, United Kingdom, Australia and other Western nations. A film that took 15 years to complete. I was many times under shelling, under attacks. I was condemned to death twice, once in Peru during the Civil War. I don't know, I mean, if you look at my body, it's full of scars, and very often I get myself to the very dangerous situations. Like in Afghanistan, I was staying in the Intercontinental Hotel always. It's just a name, Intercontinental. Actually, it's a skeleton of what it used to be. There was a crew of pilots from former Soviet Union, and they were flying Khmer, very nice guys, and they were flying heavy lifts, and they were also flying passenger planes. And once I left Kabul, and a few days later, Terrorists took over a hotel and they executed all of them at the breakfast table where I was sitting with them every day, and it was just a few days after I left. So of course, if I would be there, I would be gone as well. I got myself to all sorts of terrible war zones situations and even if nothing physically would happen, very often, like in Idlib that I mentioned, you know, I was walking through the road that was just liberated by Russian troops and by the Syrian army with a group of soldiers. And we were talking about how the occupation by ISIS really was, and we visited villages, talked to villagers. And suddenly one of the soldiers stopped and he said, "Oh, actually, you should be a bit careful because this stretch is when my brother got blown up the day before yesterday."
This evening, Los Angeles remains hot, quiet, tense, and dangerous, and 28 people are dead.
But the reason is not career. It is basically a state of the world, the horrible state of the world which I witnessed in all countries, in all parts of the globe. I visited more than 160 countries. And my conviction, actually, I'm convinced that only the struggle against imperialism can save billions of human beings who were tortured and destroyed for all these centuries. I think that Western imperialism is actually the only problem this planet has. So I go where the Western imperialism is at work, and I'm looking for patterns for how things are interconnected. Because there is nothing new what they are doing, for example, in Hong Kong. It was done in many other parts of the world. So I'm trying to show pattern, and I'm trying to show how their propaganda and then how their attacks against countries that are standing on their way, how does it work? I mean, what we saw in Hong Kong, for instance, is nothing new. It happened in every part of the world. I think the same thing was happening here in Hong Kong. Through your education, which is still very British, through certain media channels that are fully controlled by the West, through NGOs and governments from the West that are subsidizing riots. They achieved the fact that almost half of the population here suddenly believed that there is something great that can be found in the past when Britain was colonizing this city. So interestingly, the older people who still remembered the occupation and brutality and humiliation, they didn't buy into this. But the young people who never experienced it on their own skin suddenly felt that there is something great about this Western experiment called freedom and democracy, which actually has nothing to do with freedom and democracy. It was never freedom of democracy for Hong Kong when it was colonized. It was humiliation, it was occupation, and it was suffering for the people of the city. But the propaganda managed to portray it so that almost half of the city went to protest, demanding that this horrible time actually returns, waving British flags, American flags, and other flags, German flags. And so my duty is to bring philosophy, history, and facts together. British propaganda, for example, is the best. In the best, I say cynically, sarcastically, meaning the most effective. You know, if you look at the map of the world 100 years ago, you would see how almost entire planet was colonized by Europe, and increasingly then already by the United States. And they knew already then how to maintain their power and how to brainwash their people, even people they were occupying, to believing that they are actually not raping them, they are liberating them.
when we have the new locomotives from China, I'm among the few people who are going to drive about it. They felt so good. They could go all over our neighborhood telling people.
China, under the leadership of the Communist Party, is actually one of the most progressive countries on earth. It pulled out hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Their city planning is just brilliant. It serves the people very well. There are mistakes, but mistakes are being addressed. Also, the history of China here in Hong Kong is taught in a very bizarre way, including things like Chinese famine. It is blamed on the Communist Party, everything. It is not actually blamed on the Japanese occupation, which disrupted the food distribution all over China, food distribution that has basis on millennia already. I believe, after seeing the whole planet, that if Chinese experiment, if Chinese system collapses, the whole world will collapse. This is the last hope we have as a humanity. What did the West do in Africa? I lived in Africa for 5 years. Before China came, people there were robbed of absolutely everything. The Western colonialists didn't build anything. Few railroads that were in total decay. Not even schools, decent schools or medical posts. China came and it started to work with the local people, building roads, building railroads, building hospitals. You know, they got rid of malaria. Malaria in East Africa, where I lived. Malaria is a worse killer than AIDS. But it's not sexy, you know, as AIDS. So the West never touched malaria. China eradicated this in a good communist way. They came and they got rid of it in two years. Through building medical posts, bringing containers of medicine, and without much talking about it. I saw China building roads in Kenya. I talked with my friends and comrades in Kenya. We went to construction site to talk to the workers, African workers. They told me openly, they said Chinese are the first people who treat us like a human beings. If we break the equipment because we don't know how to use it, they sit down with us and they explain how to use it actually. They don't penalize us. They gave us 3 times higher salaries without us even asking than what we were making there if we worked for Germans or anybody else. And I have academics friends, and not only from China, academics friends from Australia or UK, who wrote books about this. And actually, this is known in many parts of the world that the famine in revolutionary China was not triggered by the Communist Party. It was triggered by the war, by the fact that the Japanese kidnapped the distribution system of food for their own militaristic interests. So all these things have to be revisited.
现在将联合王国国旗和香港旗升中华人民共和国国旗和香港特别行政区区旗。
I come very frequently to your city because I'm actually considering what is happening in Hong Kong very important. It is actually a battlefield between ideas, ideologies, between the Western imperialism and new Chinese wave, when China is becoming extremely and increasingly important country, actually from my point of view, working on behalf of its people and also on behalf of the oppressed people all over the world. And instead of reporting as a journalist, which I don't consider, I don't like this word journalist, to show them philosophically, historically, and through the facts, what really happened to their city before, and what the West is trying to achieve here. Recalling what was done in so many other parts of the world, and to warn that Hong Kong, if it goes through that path, is not going to actually reach the freedom. It will become another colonized and humiliated country or city or territory once again. But they are not, for many reasons, because whenever they are visited or revisited, young people start protesting because they are getting funding from the cultural institutions in Europe or in the United States or directly from the embassies. Hong Kong and China have to be tougher. They have to really defend what is theirs because they are defending 1.3 billion people, including Hong Kong, and the rest of the world.
Injection inside or almost a cleaning, because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs, so it'd be interesting to check that.
Earning good money, now I'm subject to trying to find a job for $20 an hour.
Nurse gently rebuked the protesters.
So many of you don't have face masks and are standing shoulder to shoulder.
Continues, these are voices of protest that will only grow in number.
Response, the medical, scientific response was just brilliant, and it probably saved, again, thousands of lives. So I'm very impressed. But China should not be isolated from abroad. The racism that we saw in some countries, unfortunately, like the United States and even the Philippines, is totally uncalled for. We should really combat it because there is, and again, I'm not even going to repeat it here because it's so ridiculous and so malicious. In summary, again, China reacted in a very impressive way, and there is no reason to panic. We should all stick to preventive measures and cure the people who are affected. What Hong Kong rioters wanted to do is definitely not a solution. To close the centers that are going to treat people who are infected or in quarantine, that is actually repulsive, and that also shows how low is the culture of some of the rioters who already damaged this wonderful city. China does things very correctly, and if anything, it's a victim of coronavirus. It's not a cause. There were some very terrible fake news coming from many Western outlets about how coronavirus was born. Look, the worst thing that can happen to you is that you will die. And I lived, I'm 56, and I lived maybe 15, 20 lifetimes already. And I enjoy my life tremendously. So I would love to live here until, be here until 90 or something. But I'm not going to sit down and shut up. I love this struggle. If I would sit down, you know, my eye got injured in Borneo now. I couldn't see for 3 days. Now I see a little bit, but I already began working, because if I sit down and I do nothing, I feel guilty. I feel horrible, because it's a responsibility. And Che Guevara actually, and the Cuban revolutionaries, they knew perfectly well what it is. And they said that, you know, if you work for the revolution, if you struggle for the people, it should not be worn as some kind of a medal. It is just duty that you are performing. It's nothing else. I am a communist, but modern days communist. So I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid to die. I'm not afraid to get injured.
I think you are a fighter.
I am.
Yeah.
You know, if I describe what is happening in the world, I'm protecting in many ways millions of people. And I have to do it, because if I don't, I will just not be able to face the mirror in the morning. That's as simple as that.